Yeah, welcome back everyone to the part 2 of River to Coast session. And we are literally halfway through the session, and thematically we're also at the halfway point. So we kind of heard about the upstream component. As you can see in this figure really kind of follows what we are trying to do in this session. So we talked about the upstream talks in the morning, and then Tom kind of made that comment about this connection. And then we have the shelf and coast part of this session tomorrow. So today we're going to focus in this connection point, the pivot between the upstream and the downstream component of this cycle, especially the estuary and the tidal wetlands. That's what we'll be focusing on with 5 awesome talks and 3 lightning talks. And obviously, this is the area where a lot of action is happening. And you can see in this figure, the red areas are kind of like where we lose 80% of the wetland by the end of the century. So that means a lot of carbon is going to be processed, lost, moved to different species as it flows out to the coastal ocean. And this is what all our talks will be focused on today. We have an awesome lineup for today. We have Qipei and Lisamarie talking about the coastal carbon fluxes and fate. Then we have Etienne talking about the wetland carbon loss, as we saw there, and where that carbon goes and what we are missing. Then we'll follow it up with some modeling work by Ben on the regional scale modeling for all these 3 different aspects, the land, the ocean, and estuaries and river. And then we'll have Jeremy talking about the biogeochemical changes. And then we'll switch to our 3 lightning talks for today. We'll have Xinyuan talking about dissolved organic carbon, and then Lata talking about the metabolic rates in Bay of Bengal, and then Drew will be talking about nitrogen fixation and how DOC can impact that. And after that, we'll have our panel where we hope to sort out all the unknown questions, and we'll have a straight path forward on what we should do after this. Just kidding. But with that, we can go and start our first speaker. We have Qipei and Lisa taking over on the land ocean models and how we can look at the coastal carbon fluxes and fate. With that, I'll hand it over to both of you, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Qipei. I just want to highlight how great the talks have been over these past few days. And so thank you, OCB, and then thank you for the invitation to me and to Qipei to give this presentation. And also just to today's speakers for bringing in humans, because I'm going to elaborate then on that a little bit more. I'm Lisamarie Windham-Myers. I'm from USGS in California, and I'm going to provide some coastal watershed context before shifting from Woods Hole and advances from our larger land ocean modeling team working on this NASA CMS project. We're characterizing fluxes and fates from salt marshes, one of the most managed and manipulable parts of the carbon cycle. About 1 million of the 4 million hectares of coastal wetlands in the US are now disconnected from tides. And we tend to focus on the easily measured land sink, but the ocean sink may be a larger and more important flux. I also want to highlight instrumental OCB has been in pulling together necessary institutions and pushing for synthesis, data and model improvements and representativeness in coastal carbon science. So thank you for that. So looking at the global water cycle, we cannot talk about coastlines without recognizing the overwhelming impact of humans. The land-ocean aquatic continuum must include humans. More than half live in coastal watersheds, and their water use and impacts on water quality and on flows are huge, especially true in California. Next, where we see channelized waters, interbasin transfers, groundwater depletion, levees, and muted tidal exchange. This is a 2014 Landsat 8 image of San Francisco Bay Delta, the largest estuary on the Pacific coast of the US. And we would have been meeting down here in Moffett Field had we not had travel curtailed this year. The urban development that you're seeing in the Bay and the agricultural development that you're seeing in the Delta have led to a near total disconnection of these waters from the lands that they used to flood regularly. We've lost more than 90% of our coastal wetlands since the gold rush in the 1800s. And we know significant carbon impact of that disconnection, including deeply subsided peatlands in the delta. These lands are about 30 feet below sea level, so there's a big bowl that just keeps getting deeper every day through soil oxidation. And that disconnection has also led to reduced supplies of detrital carbon into the estuary food web. So carbon cycling plays a really strong role in the freshwater delta's co-equal management goals, which are their reliability of the statewide water supply and ecosystem protection. And those are the goals of my current detail as the Delta lead scientist for the the Delta Stewardship Council of California. We also have to deal with risks associated with elevation loss and species extinctions and earthquakes. And on the positive side, wetland restoration goals are at an all-time high in California. Even the public has supported taxing themselves through proposition funding to restore wetlands and to adapt to our notably volatile climate change. Through much of this work here, you're seeing on this slide. Let me go on to the next slide, Qipei, which is one that Dr. Patty Oikawa sent to us to highlight our impressive network of hydrologic and lateral flux measurements that we're doing that are coupled with eddy covariance atmospheric flux measurements. It includes a well-studied brackish historic marsh and 2 restored marshes, one that's highly productive freshwater and one that's saline. And we have the data density and breadth to start building out process-based biogeochemical models like peppermint to include soil accumulation as well as lateral exports, which are often half or more of the total atmospheric carbon inputs. Next. So in California, I want to highlight that we did not get here by ourselves. OCB has been an incubator and an integrator of ideas. The CCAR's effort in Woods Hole in 2014 brought scientists across all of the North American coast together. Next. The WetCarb project, led by Ray Najar, set a usable framework for carbon accounting boundaries and helped prioritize research questions. Next. The 2018 OCB called for topical workshop called for the first lateral flux working group meeting in Woods Hole to share different approaches to accounting for this really critical flux. There was a lot of back of the envelope scoping on how it could be predicted and monitored. And then similarly, in the 2022 summer workshop, there was a session led by Alec Wang to explore lateral flux model progress. Next. The second state of the carbon cycle report came out in 2018, and for the first time, it highlighted the significant role of tidal wetlands and estuaries in the North American carbon budget. It also showed significant sequestration in the coastal ocean. And so these Soccer 2 chapters were like coming out parties for the coast, but they also highlighted the extreme uncertainty and research gaps. Next. The NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve Systems Science Collaborative addressed head-on the accounting that was necessary for bringing wetlands to market via carbon credits, with intense data collection and model building that was done in Falmouth, Massachusetts, particularly Sagelot Pond, which you're going to hear a lot more about from Qipei. Next. And then finally, NASA's Carbon Monitoring System program has been instrumental in helping work across this broad land-human-ocean interface with all the different monitoring tools that might be needed. It's led to a greater use of remote sensing and harmonized data for gridded products along our narrow coastlines, including, for example, this Z-star relative elevation map in salt marshes and mangroves, and then not just for carbon dioxide fluxes, but also for methane. Next. And the NASA CMS lateral flux project that you're going to hear about next is just like the others. It's a big tent approach with participants and institutions across the whole US. There's 6 specific tasks. Great. Moving from synthesis of the atmospheric and hydrologic flux data at 7 sites, building out the peppermint model to be peppermint leaf, that's the LF of lateral flux accounted for, a wetland estuary ocean mixing model to get at the fate of dissolved carbon and total alkalinity, existing and new spatial products to characterize wetland classes and conditions over time, and then also user engagement to make sure these data are useful to managers and policymakers. The goal is to quantify current fluxes and fates and then forecast what they could be, especially as we start to return connectivity to lands in the tidal frame. So to share more about that project, I'm going to transfer to Qipei Shangguan, a postdoc from WHOI who's leading the model data integration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, for this excellent overview of the past and ongoing efforts on the coastal carbon budgets. I'm Qipei, I'm from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I'm excited to share about the most recent analysis from this project. I'm going to use the Sagelot Pond Wuquo Bay complex. And Sagelot Pond is a salt marsh ecosystem in Massachusetts, and Wuquo Bay is the estuary next to it. If we think about the aquatic continuum and break down, we can have 4 different components represent 4 different biogeochemical settings from pore water, creek, estuary, and all the way to coastal sea. I'm going to show that if dissolved inorganic carbon, that's my focus today, is exported from pore water to creek, some processes that transform the dissolved inorganic carbon, DIC, change the speciation between CO2 and the carbon alkalinity. Then once DIC leaves the creek, what's going to happen? Does it stay in the aquatic pathway or is it returning to the atmosphere? So that's the fate determination, degassing versus transport. To start with, how DIC or alkalinity are generated in the pore waters. Marsh ecosystems are very productive, and they fix lots of atmospheric CO2 and the organic carbon in their soils. There are 2 primary respiration pathways, so depending on the oxygen variability. And on the first, organic carbon can be respired by aerobic pathways and produce CO2 in this way. Secondly, this is a sulfate reduction without oxygen and it generates alkalinity, and the sulfate comes from the seawater infiltration. Here, the complication is that another product is sulfur. If we want to preserve the alkalinity production, sulfur has to react with the iron to form pyrite to achieve a permanent removal. Otherwise, sulfur could potentially be oxidized again and titrate the alkalinity. With these respiration products, and they are delivered into the overlying tidal waters by pore water exchange and enter the aquatic continuum. Then they travel from the marsh, tidal creek, and to the estuary to the coastal oceans. And then thanks to the previous analysis led by Renaja, and we are very confident that this lateral flux is a big contributor for the coastal carbon budgets over here. And then we also know that estuaries are net source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But what we don't know is that how much this atmospheric degassing comes from the lateral carbon exports. Or that's exactly the same question. What's the fit for the lateral export? Does it stay in the water or does it evade to the atmosphere? This is very important because only those lateral exports arriving at the shelf waters can be considered as the long-term sequestration pathway. I'm using the word credit over here. We want to credit the lateral fluxes, and we want to credit those arriving at the shelf waters. Therefore, we need to determine the phase between the estuarine degassing and the offshore transport. And this diagram shows the carbon budgets for DIC and DOC. Another critical parameter over here is alkalinity. We need to understand the alkalinity export to determine the fits. And in the Cedar Pond, my colleagues have been collecting a very comprehensive data set from the pore water to the tidal creek. In pore water, we have DIC and alkalinity profiles, and pH, sulfate, sulfur, and they are tracers of sulfate reduction. And we also have some radiochemical tracers. The radium, thorium disequilibria will tell us the pore water exchange rates. And if we have the PEX, pore water exchange rates, and the DIC alkalinity in the pore waters, we can calculate how much DIC and alkalinity are exported from pore waters. And we also have extensive observations of the tidal creek. We are trying to develop sort of a consistent approach to calculate the lateral fluxes. And the challenge over here is that the DIC and the DOC concentrations are very dynamic. They are changing very rapidly, and we want to monitor it continuously. The strategy we have is to link DIC and the DOC to the YSI parameters, such as the pH, temperature, salinity over here. We're trying to develop a statistical algorithm to predict the DIC from these variables, and the YSI parameters can be deployed at 5-minute intervals and over multiple years. As you can see from the tidal flux of DIC and the DOC, it's very dynamic from spring tides to neap tides. And we can also calculate the interannual and monthly variations of DIC and DOC exports. Also true for the alkalinity, we can develop an algorithm. Later on, I tried the machine learning algorithm to predict the alkalinity, and we have very decent fit between the predicted alkalinity and the measured bottle samples. Then we have a high frequency alkalinity throughout the multiple years. We calculate the fluxes at the tidal creek and the pore water and put them together. We also calculate the groundwater flux at this site for more complete alkalinity budgets, but it's a small contribution. We found that the alkalinity flux in the tidal creek is much smaller than the pore water exchange. That than the fluxes from the pore water. That means lots of alkalinity, once exported from pore water, where does it go? Because they are not observed in the tidal creek. So we hypothesize it's due to the sulfide oxidation. Because sulfur is produced as well, and then oxidized back again and titrates the alkalinity. And essentially, we found that in the upper layer of the sediments, it's a very low pH, around 5 to 6, and low alkalinity. And there are net sulfide production in the upper layer of the sediments. So that's the indication of the sulfide oxidation. To further think about what's the dominating process that producing de-icing and alkalinity exports, we put them together. So as we can say in the pore water, the stoichiometry between TA flux and the de-icing flux for the pore water is very close to a sulfide reduction. That shows sulfide reduction is the primary mechanism in the pore water. So lots of de-icing exports actually are alkalinity. But once we go to the creek over here, it's a combination of sulfide reduction and aerobic respiration. I would like to point out over here, this sulfide reduction is actually the net sulfide reduction. It's a difference between total sulfide reduction and sulfur oxidation. The gray points over here are monthly observations of DIC and alkalinity fluxes. I would also like to mention that we have some alkalinity sink during the winter time. So it's importing alkalinity, consuming alkalinity in the marsh platform. Let's assume that we have no sulfide reduction during the winter time. But aerobic respiration, it will generate little protons, but that's enough to consume the alkalinity and explain the wintertime alkalinity sink. So if we have the alkalinity and DIC fluxes, then we are ready to calculate the fits of the lateral fluxes. This is a map for the Sigeout Pond. We developed the Sigeout Pond and the WHOI Bay. A map for the WHOI Bay, developed them into 6 different boxes. In the May Bay, there are 3 different boxes over here, and each of the boxes is connected to one tributary box over here. And each of these boxes have different wetland covers. Normally in the tributaries, it has a high wetland cover. That means it receives lots of wetland inputs in the tributaries. And we simulated the gas exchange, biogeochemical processes like gas exchange, net ecosystem production, and all of the different processes, and also physical mixing using the salinity budgets and the water budgets over here. So essentially, it's like 2 different differential equations like DIC over dt equals to a whole bunch of processes. And we model this DIC and alkalinity fits during 2 seasons, because during these 2 seasons, we have a nice alkalinity and DIC time series, so we can model it. By comparing these 2 seasons, we identify several critical factors that control the DIC fit. Firstly, is the ratio of DIC and alkalinity exports. So is it bicarbonate export or CO2 export? It will determine the DIC retention and degassing the estuaries. Another factor is flushing time. In the WHOI Bay, the river-dominated estuary, the flushing time changed quite a lot from 2 to 8 days over here. The flushing time controls how long the DIC will stay in the estuary before entering the coastal seas. The third factor is the pH or revival factor of the estuarine waters. If it's very high pH, let's say it has lots of carbonate, the carbonate can neutralize the CO2 formed by carbonate and help with the transport. Generally, for the entire bay, we found that 50% of the DIC is lost into the atmosphere. And this data changed quite a lot among different days because of the estuarine dynamics. If we take a further look at this individual box, I'm using the box 2 here and the box 2T as an example. Box 2T, it receives lots of that's a tributary box. It receives lots of lateral inputs. So it just emits a small amount of it to the atmosphere. And lots of the wetland DIC is transported into the box 2 over here. So very interestingly, we saw box 2 emit a lot of marsh DIC that it receives directly because it receives directly on its own because it has lots of DIC, marsh DIC from the tributary box. To summarize what we have today, so firstly, we determine the DIC and alkaline export from pore waters and the tidal creek, and then compare them. The big finding is here, the alkalinity export is very different. So if we want to report the alkalinity or DIC fluxes, it's very important to specify where these measurements are taken. This is very different from open ocean studies that commonly we think alkalinity is more conservative than DIC, but marsh is a unique environment with large redox gradients and sulfur reactions that makes alkalinity less conservative actually. Then we determine the DIC fits from the transport to the tidal creek and estuary. I'm expressing those numbers relative to the gross primary production of the wetland, JPP over here. And the tidal creek, some of the CO2 leaves directly to the atmosphere, and then once exported from the tidal creek to estuary, and half of them goes back to the atmosphere, and the other half should be credited because they arrive at the coastal oceans. And lastly, I would like to mention the ongoing work from this project. We are trying to synthesize the lateral fluxes from multiple different sites over multiple different years using the tidal creek measurements as I introduced before. And these 5 different sites represent different salinity dynamics and hydrodynamics and temperature and different biogeochemical and ecological factors. So we can say what controls the lateral exports and what's the interannual and monthly variability for future upscaling. And I want to take this opportunity to invite more collaborations to join us if you are interested in this lateral synthesis. And we are excited to work with you, and we have the codes ready to process the lateral flux data. And finally, I would like to thank all these team members. And because this is a large data collection, and no person can do this alone. And thank you for making this possible. I'll stop over here. I hope I can bring these results next time. So it's an ongoing efforts. I'll stop over here.
Thank you for the nice talk. I think we are right on time. So maybe we can hold up the questions for the panel and move on to our next speaker. We have Etienne talking about the gaps and steps for representing wetland carbon loss in global carbon budget. So Etienne, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you about my perspective on the gaps and steps towards improving representation of lateral carbon fluxes from anthropogenic disturbances. My name is Etienne Fluet-Chouinard. I'm an earth scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And today I'll be trying to tell you about 3 main points. First of all, how much wetlands have been lost, how confident are we in our estimates of loss, how do we plan on modeling, how can we integrate maps of wetland loss in historical simulation, and their consequences on lateral exports, and finally take a quick detour towards coastal wetlands and presenting some of the work we're doing here at the lab on coastal wetlands. And so if you're wondering what kind of flavor this talk will have, I'll be thinking mostly about deep time periods, so go in the past, but also thinking about how we can use these models for forecasting the future, and very much in the framework of global land surface modeling. So implementing some of these finer scale processes in larger simulations. So if you've picked up in this crowd, if you've picked up literature on and being curious about how much wetlands have been lost globally, there has been a number of estimates. Often some of the maps you see more recently covered the last couple of decades, but as we know, most of the land use change and growth has occurred in the 20th century prior to our satellite record. And so here I'm showing 3 examples of reports that show fairly large, a wide range in numbers of wetland loss. The 50% figure was repeated for a very long time with unknown sources. And so really when taken all together, there seems to be a large uncertainty on how much wetlands have been lost. And so this was kind of the driving question of this first study that I'll be telling you about. And so to reconstruct wetland loss over long time periods, as I've said, satellites aren't necessarily the main tool that we have. To get a comprehensive perspective on wetland loss, we need to account for the various drivers of loss. And so in this case, the study I conducted looked at 7 primary drivers. And here I'm going to break them down into 2 main categories. First, there's some land use drivers for which we have records, for which we have historical records. For instance, the area of farmland that is improved, so ditched, in the U.S., for instance, that's been collected in the U.S. Census since the 1900s. various entities collect these data. The UN, there's a commission on irrigation and drainage, etc. And so those are, going through over a number of years, going through historical publications. I've managed to compile over 3,000 of these point estimates of country and drained area. There's also some drivers that are not as clean cut and really don't have the same richness in records. And so we know that pastures can lead to wetland loss or degradation, but not necessarily in every case, since there's plenty of pastures that can be used even in wet conditions. Same for urban reclamation, and rice cultivation is also a transition from, and oftentimes from, a natural wetland to a managed one. And so I'll quickly, in the next few slides, go through each of these, the top row and the bottom row, just to give you a sense of how this is represented. So first of all, if we, as I mentioned, compiling 3,000 estimates, here I'm showing the main ones for the dominant countries. Individual estimates over time allow us to reconstruct a time series. And as a lot of land use, in a lot of land use trajectories follow a sigmoidal trajectory, generally with incipient primary funding, then generally kind of large funding. For instance, in this case, in the US, the establishment of drainage districts that manage waterways from which farm drainage could be connected, and generally saturation. Different countries are at different stage of these and at different and cover different areas. But these are generally generalizable patterns that we can think about globally. So these are the first four ones. And on their own, if we compare the wetland loss from these first four drivers for which we have historical records to independent estimates of wetland percentage loss, which we have over the regions I'm showing here on the map, you can see here in this predicted and observed plot that most of the points fall still close to the one-to-one line, but not quite well. And we have a lot of areas where we just aren't capturing the estimated wetland loss. And so this is where the three other drivers come in. And through a basically fitting these theta parameters for irrigated rice, pasture, and urban areas, we can try to improve the fit here. So we're going up to adjusted R-square of 0.74 by fitting these points. And so you can see comparing the graph on the right versus the one on the left, you can see a lot more of these points from the bottom right have kind of moved closer to that one-to-one line. I want to say that even with this optimization, the mean bias is between 15 and 20%. So meaning that even this is as best as we can to fit these regional estimates of percentage wetland loss, we're still underestimating with this approach. And so we have these 7 drivers, and we can map them because they're already existing historical land use maps. And so basically what I'm showing here is the expansion of wetland conversion per land use. You'll notice a few things. Of course, it grows over time. Some of the drivers that were modeled generally don't start out at 0, since they're modeled as a fraction of the overall land use. And the distribution within countries, so going from the national scale to the pixel-based grid that I'm showing here, which is much more convenient for land surface modeling, is done by the overlap of where these land uses occur, as well as where potential wetland exists. So this was based on water balance models that tell us roughly, in the absence of humans, where wetlands should be, and if we find some cropland or one of these land uses overlaps with that, we can kind of sprinkle and attribute these maps. But again, we're not necessarily only interested in the area that was lost. We're also interested in the area of wetlands overall. And so what we do with these 7 maps, we take them all together, and then we start from where we know the area of wetlands the best, which is present day. And so basically we take these drainage area and add them up from the wetland area we know for 2020. And so this gives us this animation here, which I only started in 1900, since that's where really most of the change occurs. And so this is ticking, and as we tick through, you'll see some wetlands. The area declines in different regions of the world at different times. I wanted to take the opportunity on this slide to also mention that coastal wetlands aren't really well represented by this approach for a couple of reasons. Our global remotely sensed products of inundation, often from passive microwave satellites, aren't really doing don't do great around the coast, and so those areas have been masked in many cases. And the definition of wetlands could be a bit wonky compared to more rigid definitions on the ground. And so when we put it all together, we get this map here on the right that depicts the 21% wetland loss globally. And so here I'm showing two overlaid maps. And so the blue parts are areas where there's a lot of wetlands left and there hasn't been a whole lot of loss. And then the shades of yellow to red are areas of hotspots of loss as a percentage of the original cover. And so this mapping, going from this national scale to pixel base, allows us to, of course, prescribe these maps into land surface models to get simulations of carbon fluxes to the atmosphere as well as lateral fluxes, because it allows us to also break down the loss estimates into watersheds. And I'm not going to show the ranking of watersheds. We have it in the publication if you're curious, but really it's that key step from going from national scale to units that matter more for lateral transport. And so I've been talking about wetland area, but what does it mean for carbon? And so I don't need to tell this audience about the different the impacts of loss necessarily in detail, but to take the example of peatlands, which is I think a nice simplification that mostly generalizes to other wetland types aside from coastal environments. The lowering of the water table is really what drainage, either through some surface or subsurface channels, lowers the water table, creates these oxic conditions, and increases carbon releases, as well as lateral transport to often drainage ditches where some of these emissions are displaced from the wetland surface to the drainage channels. And generally leads to a reduction in methane, although that's not necessarily the case, since part of the methane emissions from the drainage channels have been shown to offset a good amount of the lowered emissions. And so really these kind of flipping back from drainage to re-wetted is really a big part of the challenge and approach towards restoration and preventing these carbon-rich ecosystem from spewing CO2 to the atmosphere into the future. And I'm going to put this in the context of this paper from Pierre Renier that was shown, I think, by Kanchan earlier. Here I have the panel that shows the fluxes across these different units, showing, and also in red, the anthropogenic disturbance. And so in the case of here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, from terrestrial to inland waters, we're looking at about a 20% increase from anthropogenic disturbances. So this figure and these estimates were put from a literature review, and so this 0.6 petagram was includes anthropogenic contributions like deforestation, land use, sewage, weathering, but it excludes certain things like wetland drainage explicitly. And so my supposition is that wetland drainage could have been a fairly significant loss of carbon over the 20th century. Whether that is still the same today, or most of these wetlands have kind of returned to, most of these drained wetlands have returned to closer to an equilibrium is quite possible. And so the map I've shown you earlier, I think, is a really critical ingredient to including wetland loss in this estimate here from terrestrial ecosystem. I also mentioned that the repercussions, this is not a big flux, but the repercussions are fairly important, particularly in the case of the terrestrial sink, which can be estimated as a residual from the photosynthetic uptake and the outputs. And so balancing, including getting a better handle on the outputs could influence how much estimates of the residual sink. I've covered this. And so from the perspective of, we're thinking about the historical time series and mostly going deep into, let's say, a couple centuries in the past, land surface models are really well suited for that because we don't necessarily have enough data to really extrapolate present conditions. And so here I want to show two particular efforts that are branches of the Orchidea model that have been pretty influential in my thinking and how we would approach doing something like this. The first one is Orchidea Leak, which is from Ronnie Lauerwald, that includes a number of pools that are transferred along the river as well as from floodplains and to the river channel and back. So there's kind of bidirectional inundation and including processing and emissions to the atmosphere across at these different time steps. So this is great to represent the natural wetland conditions, which are key to get a counterfactual scenario if we're trying to estimate how much humans have impacted these processes. On the right-hand side, I'm showing a different branch, Orchidea peat, which simulates peatland drainage and has been applied to northern peatlands. This is very analogous to the cartoon I showed earlier of the carbon fluxes, and so in this case, to represent conversion from peatland, which is the green line and has high moisture content throughout the soil columns, they let water drain out of the bottom of the water column in croplands. So it's not necessarily an explicit representation, but it does show that the decline in water content in the cropland, and so all the knock-on effects of carbon emissions and transport in the soil column can be simulated from this impact. So these two papers have influenced my thinking, and this is a figure that I had from a proposal that I think I'll throw to this audience if there's interest in thinking about this and collaborating, rather than representing wetland drainage as water draining at the bottom of the soil column. There are ways to be a bit more explicit about prescribing a drainage depth to the top of the soil column, so preventing water from accumulating above that certain depth and draining it to a drainage canal. So this kind of representation would be a good way to account for the drainage depths that would vary across places and emissions from the drainage canals. The drainage depth and drainage density can vary across space and over time, and so there's been some incipient efforts to compile some of these drivers of wetland loss and accounting for that heterogeneity. We are not there yet in having a wall-to-wall coverage, but starting with these compilations is the first step towards imputing these data globally. So far I haven't really mentioned much about coastal wetlands, but the reason they haven't really made it in that reconstruction I started to talk with are that a lot of these drivers are very specific to coastal wetlands. So mariculture, barriers to migration, and particularly some interesting, with particular interest, drainage canals that were meant initially to remove the wetlands can also act as a highway or as a pathway to. Timer just went off, so I'll just finish really quickly. Pathways for sea level rise to affect wetlands. And so my last two slides are simply about what we're doing here at the lab. So we have the COMPAS FME project, which hopes to include and represent coastal areas and wetlands in Earth system models. So going from that top part here to a more explicit representation. And we do this in a number of ways. We have highly instrumented sites along the East Coast and Great Lakes, as well as expanded modeling effort. And to simply quickly jump into the modeling effort that I'm participating in order to generalize these models at the sites into new locations to eventually get coastal wetland simulations nationwide, potentially eventually globally. We're using SWAT satellite to get the tidal boundary, water elevation, and salinity through some machine learning, feed that to ELM column, which itself is then fed into a reaction network accounting for a number of redox interactions and spitting out depth resolved salinity, O2, and complex redox interactions. So this is ongoing work and hopefully can be informed by participants today. And so to summarize very quickly, global wetland loss of 21% is probably a lower bound, and there's a lot of space here to improve on that. And if we are trying to simulate carbon losses, accounting for water table depth and representing that a bit more explicitly in models is a key step. For modeling coastal wetlands, really we're leaning into accounting for extreme events and as the drivers of change. And finally, most of what I've shown you here has either included anthropogenic effects or natural effects, but very few of them actually are represented together in the same scenarios in reconstruction. And so that's a challenge to be for the community. So, and Thank you very much, and sorry to go over time.
Thank you, Etienne. Really nice talk. We already have questions for you, but we're going to hold off on those till the panel. Jeremy, are you ready to go ahead?
I think I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. I'm gonna end up talking about nutrients more than carbon, and I'm gonna end up kind of focusing on a case study that I decided would help me sort of describe some of the evolution of some quantitative thinking around the role of wetlands and nutrient transformations along the coast. And, I'm an ecosystem ecology. Often I'm interested in looking at bigger scales and scaling up. But in this case, I'm almost sort of looking in the other direction, thinking about getting closer to representing dynamics in the near shore. So everybody that I've heard talk about, is kind of talking about these different scales at which we do this kind of science. And there's been a lot of really compelling, sophisticated presentations on this kind of left-hand side here, looking at kind of how we look at, the role of the land, river, estuary, ocean transition, kind of at the continental scale that might be global or regional, thinking on tens of kilometers of timescales. But, a lot of the nitty-gritty dynamics driving a lot of these processes happen at much smaller, finer scales. And I'm going to try to, get to how things I've seen in the field have evolved to sort of better represent these things numerically and how that might help us quantify things related to things like carbon export, nutrient uptake in this sort of land water filter, which often we think about as being valuable for nutrient management. So what kind of got me thinking about this is did my sabbatical in Denmark last year, and last November, maybe many of you, maybe some of you know, the Danish government passed this green legislation. They called it the Green Tripartite, which is like the English version of the word, but it's a pretty ambitious environmental plan. And one part of it is to convert 10% of the existing farmland, I think primarily along the coast, back into forest or some other habitat. So there's this big investment happening in restoring this sort of land-water interface with the assumption that it's going to provide these coastal filter kind of processes. And it's kind of motivates us to start thinking about what we know about this. Another example of this, kind of getting down to an even more local scale, is that in the Chesapeake Bay region where I do a lot of my work, the thinking about the restoration relative to reducing nutrients towards meeting water quality goals in that estuary has really sort of gone on this path towards thinking at the smaller scale, thinking more locally. There's this big nutrient budget for the whole ecosystem, but now people are thinking about how we might change the restoration and the way we guide that restoration based on, these ever smaller areas. And, one of the reasons for that is, I guess, the recognition that, to sell these expensive restoration efforts to the public, we need to be doing things that relate to their daily lives, where when you get to scales where the way people manage their own property might be relevant to the process. And so part of that effort has involved developing and applying ever more resolved and sophisticated, at least in terms of the physics, the biogeochemistry and the models used to do that. So this is just an example, the sort of old model that was used for the past several decades. Each one of these red dots is a node in that model. And then on the right-hand side is the new version of that model, where now all of a sudden, the details of all of these sort of, small estuarine environments and how they interact with the land can be better resulted. And so the way I sort of came about thinking of this is, starting with this idea that, that the land-water interface can be a filter for nutrients that's relevant to all these programs to restore water quality. And so I wanted to sort of start with maybe the simplest kind of quasi-quantitative way that people have thought about this. So Scott Nixon had organized this big workshop in the 90s to look at nitrogen and phosphorus at the land-sea margin, kind of at the scale of the North Atlantic Ocean. And one of the products that came out of this are the black circles on this figure, which is the percent of nitrogen exported from an estuary versus its residence time. And so the idea is that, you know, at the higher residence time, much less nitrogen is exported, meaning that because it's spent more time in the estuary, perhaps it's been lost via burial, denitrification, a process like that. My colleague Walter Boynton gathered some data in these red dots here that are a bunch of estuaries that have really dominant coastal wetlands in them. And so the idea here is that, you know, for a given residence time, you're getting much less nitrogen exported. And so therefore, wetlands must be, you know, an important part of this nitrogen removal process. This has been known for a long time. This isn't new, but it's sort of an early way to think about it. So one of these red dots is the Patuxent River, which Blake talked about earlier, which is one of the tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. And that's where I'm going to focus my little review and synthesis. So here's the Patuxent River. It's sort of in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay region on the east coast of the United States. And so just to give you the idea of this case study that I'm working on. Okay, so following that figure you saw before, my colleague Walter Boynton worked on a nutrient budget of this particular estuary. And this was kind of at the core scale of dividing the estuary kind of in two, the upper, mostly low salinity oligohaline part of the estuary, and then kind of the more mesohaline part of the estuary. And this budget you're looking at here is just for that upper part. And this upper part's really dominated by wetlands. And if you look at sort of the watershed input, which is about 54,000 kilograms of nitrogen per day, and you look at all the losses, including the export, there would have been, you know, almost 15,000 to 2,000 or 1,500 to 2,000 kilograms per day missing nitrogen in this budget. But if estimates of denitrification and burial in the extensive tidal marshes were included in this budget, it sort of not only balanced, but it just sort of emphasized how important this loss was there. So it really, and it's also important that these marsh end sinks were about 30% of the input. So it kind of was another step, another piece of evidence to kind of support this idea. So I had sort of started working in the system around the time these things were happening. And what I ended up doing, actually, this is something I had worked on like 15 or 20 years ago. And I rediscovered it when I was thinking about this talk. And so one thing I had done, this is the upper Patuxent estuary here. The blue is the river and the green are the wetlands. And so you can just see how the wetlands are, you know, in some ways like half to even more of the sort of area of this wet part, or at least occasionally wet part of the system. And so this is kind of a picture of what it looks like up there. These are sort of emergent tidal freshwater species, and you get the sense that they just sort of dominate the environment. So I had done, you know, tried to get at quantifying the potential uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus and silica in this region dominated by marshes, and to try to separate it from the other potential sources. So I used kind of a simple salt and water balance model to do that. We just heard about, you know, a version of this before. Maybe some of you are quite familiar with these, but the idea behind one of these models is that you can build a balance typically for salt, but I use conductivity because of the environment that I was working in. And so you sort of account for the change in the tracer over time, and you have the advective inflows and advective outflows, and, you know, some non-advective exchange. And so I developed this model at a monthly timescale for, you know, a couple of decades. And then once I had the conservative model calculated, you could use those and pair them with concentrations of solutes of interest, you know, nitrogen, phosphorus, and do the same kind of balance. And the only difference now is you have a residual because it's a non-conservative term, and that residual can represent the net production, a negative net production, meaning a net consumption. Okay. So one thing to know about this system is that, yes, it's dominated by wetlands, but there's also pretty intense accumulations of algae that happen here. So you're just looking at chlorophyll in the surface water over the salinity gradient in the estuary. And these this top line here is the summer condition. So you can see in this tidal fresh region where all the wetlands are, there's also a big amount of chlorophyll in the summer when the wetlands are most active. So I needed to try to account for that in this budget. So what I did is I first sort of did this box model calculation and calculated the net production of total organic carbon. And then I also computed the net production of chlorophyll and, just making some assumptions about carbon to chlorophyll ratio, estimated the carbon production that would be associated with that. And these two things actually ended up matching pretty well. And they sort of give you the impression that there's sort of a seasonal peak kind of in the warm season here. We're in the temperate world. And so the next thing I did is I had the same net production rates for dissolved inorganic nitrogen, dissolved silica, and dissolved inorganic phosphorus. And so on these graphs, you can see that there's these white squares, which are the expected consumption if you just assume Redfield stoichiometry. And then the black squares are what the box model calculation produces. And so here you see the net total uptake is way more than you'd expect from phytoplankton. So it's sort of consistent with the idea that maybe these marshes are the source of that N loss. But interestingly, if you look at the inorganic phosphorus, the net for the whole model was actually lower than what was expected from the primary production. So this could be an indication that the marshes might be an actual source of phosphorus that's sort of overcompensating for this algal effect. So you kind of have a solute specific filter here. Okay, so the important thing here is that this is a relatively coarse scale model. And we're really just getting net rates. So, even this discrepancy between these two lines here, it's assuming the marsh is the dominant role, but we don't know for sure. So around the same time, there's another group that was using, a more conventional, high resolution, three-dimensional hydrodynamic biogeochemical model in the same region. And they were sort of testing how good the model was. And one of the things they discovered in their model was that they were missing the nitrate and other solutes, but really missing the nitrate and the total nitrogen in this upper part of the estuary. So this red box here is where I just showed you a bunch of information for. That's the high wetland area. And so what you're looking at in these graphs are the difference between the model and the observed, where positive means that there's much more modeled than is actually observed there. And this discrepancy where the model thinks there's a lot more nitrogen than there should be is right where the marsh area is really high relative to the sort of length of the estuary. And so another thing, so the Williams et al. Study really sort of suggested, well, we're not really measuring marshes. It must be the marsh filter that's doing that, but we don't represent that. And this difference here is in milligrams per liter, 1 milligram per liter, it's 70 micromolar nitrogen. I mean, these are big numbers that the model's missing. And so it really hammers home the idea that you need a better tool to really represent this. And so I kind of want to just finish by highlighting, just one of the newer models that's out there that's trying to represent these marsh dynamics with a little bit more high resolution and sophistication. So this is from some of Nicole Tsai's work, who I think is on this talk. And so this is not from the Patuxent, but it's from the York, which is a similar kind of environment in the same ecosystem. And many of you may know this paper, but implemented marsh biology and some biogeochemistry of a wetting and drying wetland into one of these 3D numerical models, and maybe more importantly, have the high resolution to actually capture the ins and outs of this marsh. And so just to show you some of the results of that, as I'm sort of interpreting them, are a couple of things. So the first is that if you look at the phosphorus, the blue lines here are the base run with the marsh, and the orange lines are without the marsh model there. So there's a lot more phosphate, and there's phosphate flux when the marshes are there. And so it suggests that the marshes are sort of accumulating particulate phosphorus, and it's getting released. And maybe being exported from the marsh. And that's consistent with what the box model, simple box model actually showed. And another perhaps related part of this is that the oxygen was, basically at saturation without the marsh there. But when you added the marshes, the oxygen got pretty low in these different adjacent environments and had a lot of variability, maybe even tidal scale variability. And so this could impact all of these processes. And also note that the nitrogen, there's denitrification happening when the marsh is there too. So that's consistent with the N loss. But coming back to the oxygen, it struck me because during this past time when I was working there was, I deployed some oxygen sensors in a marsh creek in this upper part of the Patuxent and compared them to a sensor out in the Maine channel. And this, these deployments happen for about 2 weeks. And if you look at the dissolved oxygen in the sort of black triangles here, that's out in the channel. And then these sort of thinner lines are in the Marsh Creek. So you can see that inside the Marsh Creek, you really see this tidal scale oxygen variability. It's substantial, going from 12 milligrams per liter to 3 in the course of a day, maybe even 2, and getting actually quite low. So, this dynamic is actually sort of represented in that type of model. And it just emphasizes the fact that, moving forward, even though we need to be considering all of these dynamics, obviously on continental and global scales, we're at the place now we can have the other perspective where we try to look at them on a more local level. So I think I'll sort of wrap up there. I mean, here's my conclusions, but I think the main conclusions are that these transformations can be constituent specific, example, nitrogen versus phosphorus. These wetland influences on oxygen, might actually be important to represent as we think about how these wetlands interact. And that the representation of these in the model I showed and many others out there is getting pretty sophisticated. So yeah, that's what I wanted to cover today. Thanks for listening and thanks for having me here to present.
Thank you for your talk and willing to go early. We're back for our 3 exciting lightning talks. We'll start off first with Xinyuan about fate of terrestrial dissolved organic matter in Gulf of Maine.
I'm Xinyuan from the University of Maine. I'm going to present our project, the potential phase of the terrestrially derived dissolved organic carbon in the Gulf of Maine. For this project, we would like to track the potential phase of the terrestrially derived DOC in the coastal ocean. And for our project, our study area includes 3 watersheds, the Penobscot, Kennebec, and the Androscoggin watersheds. All of them are in Maine. For the 3 watersheds, most of the region is covered by forest. Generally, more than 80% of the land is covered by trees. For this project, we couple different models and would like to apply different models to understand their potential phase. For this project, we couple 2 models. The first model is a terrestrial aquatic lateral dissolved organic carbon flux model. For this model, it can simulate the DOC loading from the forest soil to the inland water, and it also simulates the biogeochemical processes in the inland water, including the burial, mineralization processes, and finally, it can simulate how much TDOC will be delivered to the coastal oceans through the river outlet. For our study area, there are 2 major rivers, the Penobscot River and the Kennebec River, and both of them are drained. All of the 3 watersheds are drained by the 2 rivers. So finally, with this model, we can estimate daily how much TDOC will be delivered to the ocean, and the daily delivered DOC to the coastal ocean. This data will be used by another model, the coastal particulate tracking model. For this model, it's a 3D model, and it divides the ocean water to a lot of cubes. For this model, it can simulate the DOC movement within each cube and between different cubes. In addition, it also simulates the biogeochemical processes of the DOC in the ocean water. Finally, we performed a simulation of 6 months because this is a short-term simulation because the simulation speed is really slow. We used about 2,000 clusters and conducted the simulation for 4 weeks. It's faster than the real world, but it's still slow. After 6 months and the model simulation results let us know after 6 months how much TDOC is still suspended in the coastal water and how much buried in the sediment. In addition, it also provides the information about the bio and the photomineralized TDOC in the coastal ocean. Okay, and finally, we found that generally after 4 months of the TDOC in the ocean water, the simulation results figured that generally after the 4 months, more than 50% of the TDOC is biomineralized, and about 5% is photomineralized, and around 7% is buried in the ocean sediment. And this type of TDOC can be treated as the long-term carbon sequestration, because generally in the ocean, the disturbances is hard to move this carbon to the ocean water again and decompose them. So we can assume them as the long-term carbon sequestration. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go on to the next talk by Lata.
Yeah, thank you. And OCB and team, thank you very much for this opportunity. Myself, Lata, presently I'm at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego, like UCSD, and I'll be talking about or presenting my work that I did during my PhD at CSIR National Institute of Oceanography in India at Goa University as well. So it's mainly about like how the monsoon-driven river discharge pattern and magnitude controls significantly the biogeochemical changes in tropical estuaries and further to the coastal Bay of Bengal. Yeah, so we selected one of the second largest river, the perennial, non-perennial river, the Godavari estuary, which covers almost like 1,500 kilometers. It is the second largest one and 32nd largest in terms of the water discharge. And based on the salinity pattern, this entire river, almost like 130 kilometers area we covered, the upper estuary where the salinity was almost 0, the middle where it was almost like 15 PSU, then the down part, the downstream estuary where salinity went up to 29, and the coastal area where salinity was almost like 35. And also the Bay of Bengal, the coastal Bay of Bengal, where 5 rivers and the adjacent coastal region were also covered during the monsoon time. So yeah, so this is just the hydrography. The first graph, if you see, it is about the river discharge pattern, which mainly starts soon after the monsoon, and it was the highest, approximately like more than 20,000 meters cube per second. And based on the river discharge pattern, we divided the seasons like no discharge period, then moderate discharge, big discharge, based on the magnitude of the discharge. And significantly, it controlled all the hydrography like salinity, nutrients, suspended matter, phytoplankton, biomass, in terms of chlorophyll. Everything was significantly controlled by this discharge pattern. So I will not explain in detail all these figures. Yeah, so also the organic matter concentration and its nature and sources also varied based on the monsoon and the river discharge pattern. So mainly, and also it varied from like spatio-temporally from upstream to downstream and during the different months. So this figure shows 1 year data at bi-monthly, like I mean every 15 days we collected the data. So almost like 15% of POC was removed from the water column, maybe either through sedimentation or the heterotrophic, to meet the heterotrophic carbon demand. And also we measured this isotopes of like delta 13C and N15 ratios, and realized that the peak discharge, during the peak discharge, the entire organic matter was more of the terrigenous, and other periods like no discharge and mid, like even moderate discharge time, it was more of autochthonous or like in situ produced. And CN ratio was showing like almost 86% deviation from the Redfield ratio, which is also showing the significant control of the river discharge and the monsoon pattern. Yeah, we also identified the possible sources of organic matter in this estuary using different proxies like C3 plants, C4 plants, or the soil organic matter, freshwater planktons, marine planktons, and came to conclusion that freshwater planktons were dominantly contributing to organic matter during the dry season or the no discharge time, whereas C3 plants from the catchment region were mainly contributing to organic matter during the peak discharge time, whereas the freshwater plankton were dominant during moderate discharge time. Yeah, coming to then bacterial activities, which was really actually coinciding with the organic matter data, and the respiration rates were highest during the peak discharge time. Though it was terrigenous matter, it may be because of the bacterial community also varied, and during the peak discharge time, they were more of like formicutes like land-driven. So that might have led to like high respiration rates. And the growth efficiency rate showed that almost like 82% of the utilized carbon gets respired back to the atmosphere through these heterotrophic activities. And the PCO2 levels we measured in the estuary over the time, spatio-temporally, and it was almost like the highest was like 34,000 microatmosphere, which was higher during the peak discharge and moderate discharge time. So that leading to like Godavari estuary kind of high CO2 emissions. So very high one because of all this terrigenous matter that comes in and gets modified efficiently. A similar study we did at the same time during the monsoon in coastal Bay of Bengal, where 5 rivers were covered from north to south. Towards the northern region, where these perennial rivers like Ganges and Mahanadi has the major impact, whereas towards the southern part, these non-perennial rivers like Krishna, Krishna, Vamsadhara, Hayadri, these are the rivers which brings more of terrigenous matter. So even the suspended matter, yeah, so DOC, POC, they were all higher towards the southern part compared to the northern part. The isotopic ratios, isotopic ratios also showed the similarity with more of depleted values in the southern part and more of lighter values towards the northern part, showing more of in situ production in northern parts, and also showing the impact of like Mahanadi and Ganges. PCO2 levels were also high towards the southern part, which was also correlated or significantly related to the bacterial activities, which I have not shown here. Possible sources of organic matter in the northwestern region, where more of in situ production was dominating, the marine planktons were contributing significantly, whereas in southern part where terrigenous signals were observed, C3 plants were contributing like majorly. Yeah, so the message is that we conclude here is like the monsoon driven, the river discharge pattern and the magnitude has a huge impact on biogeochemistry of the river, estuary, and subsequently the coastal region, which in turn impacts the biological activities and processes, mainly towards the carbon cycle. And presently, what are the climatology changes, environmental changes that is going on will have impact, and it is showing the impact, especially in the tropical regions, on monsoon pattern, the monsoon intensity, which will have a significant impact on biogeochemical processes and also like heterotrophy contribution, and as well as the ocean atmospheric exchanges and the processes. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Now we can convene the panel. So, we can open up the discussion. And before we start that, I really like to thank everybody for taking the time to give your presentation. I know there was a lot of things that happened going from in person to online, but it worked out really well. And thanks for all the great talks. So for the panelists, I have been going over quite a few questions that we got on the in the chat. So maybe we can start off with some of the questions I see here. Some of them I think are really cool. And one of the questions I saw earlier on that Lisa asked Jeremy is about how the Danish policy of restoring 10% of the wetland what was it based on? Do you want to respond to that?
I'm happy to respond. I don't know that I can give you a satisfying answer. I mean, it's, I think the reason I brought it up, I don't know why, right? And I think forests are a potential part of that strategy too. Like I would be speaking out of turn if I claimed to know the details of some of what they're thinking. But you know, the reason I raised it is because implicitly, I think there's an assumption that by restoring land and taking it out of agriculture, that it's you know, it's going to have a positive effect on nitrogen in particular, which is their focus. And the 10% I think probably came out of a lot of negotiations because, you know, I think they're planning on, I mean, to pay for that is going to be, you know, something quite substantial. And that land reclamation is only one part of the plan. So
thanks, Jeremy. While I have you here on the speaker, I'll ask you two other questions that got asked in the chat, if that's okay. So the other one was from Tom Bianchi. Tom was asking about the epiphytic algal communities that are supported on the marsh surface and how they might be influencing the nutrient and oxygen cycle.
I think they are there, and I think they have to be part of the story. And I think actually that, you know, people in the marshes that I was talking about have made measurements of ammonium, nitrate, phosphate, and silicate at low and high tide in these channels. And, you know, the difference being like if the concentration at the low tide, you know, kind of represents kind of the net effect of the marsh platform. It's not quite a platform like a salt marsh in some of these places, but you see a lot of apparent silica uptake, even in the winter when it's kind of a mud flat. So there's some thinking there that there's benthic diatoms there that are having a real effect. And there's also, you know, more freshwater vegetated plants like hydrilla that grow in some of these marsh channels too. So, you know, like, you know, maybe thinking ahead, if we can implement a model that represents, you know, things like Spartina, I don't see why we couldn't incorporate algae and, you know, aquatic macrophytes at the same time.
So one more question for you, 3 in a row, from Shaili about what was the nutrient in your model that was kind of the limiting nutrient that the model was predicting?
Yes, it was, I think it was in the middle of your talk where you were talking about this is a mostly coarse model outputs, and you had a slide of nitrogen uptake, silicon uptake, and phosphorus uptake versus predicted versus observed. And it looked like the model predicted quite a lot of silicon and phosphorus uptake at the same time, but the observed uptake was different, where the silica wasn't taken up as much, but the phosphorus, the model seemed to track phosphorus uptake a little bit more closely. So I was just wondering about like what nutrient of those 3 macronutrients, what was the nutrient limitation that was predicted by the model versus what was observed?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I didn't explain that figure well enough. So the 2 lines on that plot were, one is kind of the net, if you want to call it the net ecosystem uptake predicted by that mass balance calculation. And then the other line was the net uptake of that constituent based on the sort of ratios assumed from algal productivity. So the idea is to separate, because there's a lot of algal biomass in that part of the river at this time of the year. And, you know, and there's actually some diatom blooms that happen up there at that time of the year too. But there's no like nutrient limitation as you would expect in a biogeochemical model. These are just sort of, you know, I was trying to derive what was in excess of what you would expect from just algae as a proxy for what the marsh was doing in that region of the estuary. But most of the models that are used in this region have like a phosphorus, a nitrogen, and a silica limitation for the most of the plants. Maybe not the macrophytes.
Okay.
Silica, but yeah.
That's interesting, considering how near shore that is. Thanks.
Yes, so we also had quite a few questions for Etienne and Xinyuan that has been answered in the chat, but everyone feel free to jump in, and if you have any questions, I see Yashin Lee raised his hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have a similar question to what our facilitator Dafe raised in the morning to the morning session, which is drivers of change on top of the stationary equilibrium status. Specifically, what recent advancements have you observed on the land-sea interface or in estuaries and coastal wetlands that are changing because of changing climate? Or instead, how have you found out that these systematic changes could feed back on climate? Thank you. So aside from the land use and other anthropogenic drivers that has been talked about by various speakers, what climatic feedback have you observed in this system?
Maybe I'll answer this question first. And thanks for your question. And from my talk, I'm trying to present the fluxes across multiple years. That's the salt marsh exports across multiple years. And the motivation to do the multiple year measurements is that we are trying to capture the climate signals. And from my knowledge, I know that as the sea level is going up, there is an increased rate of pore water exchange. So there is a increased rate of lateral exports in the salt marsh ecosystem. But that's just right now, I just processed a single site. I'm not sure how other sites behave right now, but we do see some climate signals in our seashore pond site. The sea level rise can control the pore water exchanging rates over multiple years. Thank you.
I'll just chime in that from California, we don't see really large changes in sea level rise right now. We don't have big jumps or anything, but the hydroclimate is so volatile that we go from being, just some of the wettest years on record to the driest, and it has very strong effects on the salinity gradients that we see and the extension of the time frame of that salinity. And also on things like nutrients in the water, again, just, elevated concentrations when dilution is low. So those are the kinds of, I'd say hydrology is a bigger year-to-year variable than sea level rise.
Thank you both.
If I can quickly chime in, one advance that I think from the modeling side that I think is really interesting that I'm not involved in, but I think is really key to the long-term forecast are the representation of coastal vegetation as plant functional type. And so there's a facet in the model that does plant demographics and accounts for salinity resistance and a number of things. And so that's ongoing work. How many plant functional types and which gradients are the most relevant to represent is useful. But I think for capturing and be able to forecast things like ghost forests that are really driven by these short but increasing short events that increase in frequency, those seem to be really the ones really driving and stressing the vegetation and kind of kicking off that downward spiral that ends up with the ghost forests.
Any other questions for the panelists here?
Can I ask a question of Etienne? Great, thanks, Kanchan. Etienne, I didn't read your 2023 paper, but we estimated how much carbon had been lost through drainage here in the San Francisco Bay Delta, and it's huge. It's like half a petagram. I'm curious, is there differences in the fate of the carbon you think lost from those different drainage processes, or do you think they're all could be used to calculate how much has entered the atmospheric pool? I'm just curious if you have a sense of how to use those drainage data to talk about the effect of past.
Yeah, I think at the highest level, things like residence time and kind of how much burial happens. And so that kind of depends where along the continuum it might be and if there's fluctuation of like sulfates and things like that. So I think at the highest level, that would be the things that would affect how much, once you know how much carbon is kind of running off or being drained, what the fate of that carbon is. Some of the follow-up studies that have kind of taken that map and try to estimate, it's mostly been atmospheric fluxes, that estimates that people have been working on. And my intuition was that time since drainage would matter, that, you see these subsidence poles, in Florida where, it's a meter deeper than 150 years ago. And I really thought that would matter quite a bit, but in the models, it doesn't seem to really line up. So it might just be that statistically we don't have enough power to represent that. But my thinking was that eventually through compaction and oxidation, the ecosystem would return to equilibrium more or less. And that really hasn't been the case. It might just be that we don't have enough of these subsidence studies over kind of decadal time steps. And so, yeah, so I think that I think that should matter, but I think we're not there. So I think that's another one that might affect. So to kind of end up, to kind of put a bow on that, the reason I think that matters is that if we're trying to reconstruct the carbon budget and the export rate and how much ends up in buried, et cetera, my thinking is that probably that peaked somewhere in the mid-century when a lot of fresh drainage, a lot of fresh carbon was being released all at once. And so those huge pulses, I imagine, I don't know if that really would have affected that partitioning between burial and emission.
I think we have reached the end of this session. Thank you to all our speakers and also being on the panel and answering all the questions. And thanks to all the audience who made it today.